locomotive was built in 1957 and is a pinnacle of steam engineering. But its major engineering features were invented 150 years earlier by a genius, the engineer Richard Trevithick. How, in the age of horse-drawn travel, did somebody create the prototype for all future steam locomotives? It's a lovely place, Cornwall. That's why its biggest industry is holidays. More caravans than cows. But peaceful, idyllic, pastoral Cornwall has a hidden past. And this is Cornwall's dark secret. Heavy industry. Mining, casting. Cornwall was every bit as grubby as Manchester, Birmingham or Sheffield.
Even now, 200 years later, the landscape is still littered with monuments to its past. These derelict engine houses once resonated with the noise of steam giants pumping out water and lifting ore from deep underground. Entire families were employed in the Cornish mining industry. Into one of them was born a master, Richard Trevithick, in 1771.
This area was completely dominated by mining. The young Trevithick could have looked in any direction and he would have seen a mine. His father was a mine captain, a mine engineer, and every single mine had one of these, a steam engine. Trevithick wasn't an academic. He left school as early as he could. But right from an early age, he loved wandering around his dad's mine. That's where he learnt about metallurgy, about hydraulics, about metals, about steam. He was surrounded by steam. At the age of 19, Trevithick got his first job in mining. And word went out that he was a natural talent, a natural engineer, a problem solver.
But even so, nobody at the time imagined this was the man who would build the first high-pressure steam engine, the first car, and the world's first railway locomotive. Standing a stocky 6'2", he towered over at the Cornishmen of the time. His strength was legendary. It was said he could throw a sledgehammer right over the top of an engine house. But more to the point, he was a man of ideas. Ideas of how to make steam engines better.
The steam engine was life and death to a mine. The minerals in Cornwall are held in granite, in veins, in fissures in it. In order to extract them, you have to go deep. And once you go deep, you've got two major problems, both of which the steam engine will solve for you. First of all, you have to bring your ore back up to the surface, and the steam engine can do that. It can wind things up and down for you. And secondly, if you dig a big hole, what happens to it? It fills up with water. All that has to be pumped out. Millions and millions of gallons of it. And a steam engine can do that.
It works like this. You have an overhead beam with a piston in a cylinder at one end and pump rods at the other. The weight of the rods pulls the beam down. But then you need something to push it back up again. And that's where the steam comes in. Put it in here, a closed cylinder, and it expands one side of the piston and condenses on the other. The piston moves up and down. Simple.
It's reliable and safe. It works on low pressure steam, only 4 pounds per square inch. And that's its limitation. If you want any more power, there's only one thing you can do. Bigger beam, bigger cylinder, bigger boilers.
You just have to make it bigger.
This is a 90-inch cylinder engine. The metal in this engine alone weighs 122 tons. And all that metal needs to be supported. Look at the weight of this beam. The wall that this beam sits on is 7 feet thick, made of granite. Altogether, with the engine, the metal moving parts, and the load-bearing walls, the boiler house, this whole mechanism weighs thousands of tons. It's a colossal piece of machinery, but it's inefficient. The problem was, Boulton and Watt, the inventors of this kind of engine, held a monopoly. No one was allowed to make any experimentation whatsoever. And to young, brilliant Cornish engineers like Richard Trevithick, this was incredibly frustrating.
The brilliant Richard Trevithick could see that condensing steam was unnecessary. If high-pressure steam was used to push the piston up and down, you wouldn't need bulky condensers and huge buildings to put them in. He thought to himself, I could make a smaller, more powerful one of those. When Boulton and Watt's patent expired in 1800, Trevithick was at last free to develop his ideas. He had the full support of the Cornish mine owners, who, having paid handsomely for their beam engines, were still obliged to pay an additional royalty to Boulton and Watt based on the fuel they were saving.
Watt thought that Trevithick was an upstart and that he was trying to muscle in and take his position as head of the steam establishment. And he was dead right.
Trevithick's plans to build small, high-pressure engines were highly controversial. High-pressure steam is intrinsically dangerous. Blow up a balloon too far and eventually it'll go bang. So will a steam boiler, as previous catastrophic attempts had proven.
As a practical engineer, Trevithick set to work to solve the problems of using high-pressure steam. And through adaptation and experimentation, he very soon proved that it was possible. So, with increased efficiency, you could start to make your engines more portable. You could move them around. They were much more adaptable. So if you could move them around, why not make them move under their own power, under their own steam?
He put his designs down on paper and then made a small working model on the kitchen table. It worked brilliantly. So, he built a full-size one, himself.
When you compare this with a huge stationary Boulton and Watt engine, you start to realise how revolutionary it was and how many problems Trevithick solved. First of all, he is working with high-pressure steam. So he has to have a round boiler in order to contain that high pressure. And in order to make it safe, he has to have a safety valve, both new. In order to make the engine move along, in order to be able to carry everything with it, he can't have a separate furnace, so he puts the furnace inside the boiler. The firebox and the furnace is inside there, surrounded by the water. Same again, he can't have a separate piston somewhere else, a cylinder, so the cylinder goes inside the boiler. It's inset. And this, amazingly, 28 years before it was supposed to be invented, is a blast pipe, exhausting steam up the chimney to aid ventilation. It's absolutely revolutionary.
All Trevithick's ideas. An exhaust blast, an internal firebox, the cylindrical boiler. These would become the standard for steam locomotive design. But would the prototype work?
Christmas Eve 1801, the road locomotive got its first run at the bottom of Camborne Hill. Trevithick was so confident of its abilities that not only did he decide to tackle an incline, but he took half a dozen passengers along with him as well. Just imagine what the bystanders would have thought of this hissing, scary, chuffing monster. It's called the Puffing Devil. It's called that because instead of condensing, the steam goes up the chimney. Chuff, 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 chuff. It's amazing. I mean, 200 years ago, just imagine what this would have felt like. Scary. 4 days later, on December the 28th, Trevithick set off with his posse on another jaunt. His cousin was in charge of steering, but the clumsy tiller was wrenched out of his hand and the machine fell in a gully. They hauled the machine out and then left it in a small roadside shelter. In spite of it being one of the coldest nights of the year, what happened next was very surprising.
The parties adjourned to the hotel and comforted their hearts with a roast goose and proper drinks. Forgetful of the engine, its water boiled away. The iron of the boiler became hot, and nothing combustible remained of either the engine or the house.
The destruction of his first locomotive didn't seem to worry Trevithick. He'd done that. He'd already moved on. He was thinking about the future. How to build a better locomotive from the lessons he'd learned and the mistakes he'd made.
Not one to be daunted, he soon came up with his next revolutionary idea. A car.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a very different type of vehicle. The 1803 Trevithick London carriage. This, of course, is a replica built by Tom Brogden, who's hiding over there.
This was Richard Trevithick's second attempt to build a passenger-carrying road vehicle, and, some might say, the world's first car.
These driving wheels are 8 foot in diameter. It was an attempt to make the ride less bone-shaking.
The big wheels did give it a smoother ride, but also put a lot of strain on the flimsy chassis. And why was the chassis flimsy? Because the engine wasn't powerful enough to cope with anything heavier, even at a pressure of 30 pounds per square inch, 3 times that of a Watt engine, and a pressure most people would consider lethal.
It's at 40 pounds per square inch now, just over, and the safety valve is now blowing off, rather uncomfortably, right up the back of the passenger portion of the vehicle. This low boiler pressure meant that it was at a very low speed, 5 miles per hour, with a top speed of 8. But the biggest single problem with the vehicle was the drive. Trevithick's preferred method was under patent at the time, part of Trevithick's life, patents. So he had to use a much inferior single-piston geared drive that could only drive one wheel at a time. So the vehicle had a tendency to twist, to flex, and was always favouring whichever driving wheel was in use at the time.
The London carriage might have been slow, but it succeeded in carrying 8 people some considerable distance.
It's an extraordinary machine. It's very bumpy. It's weird to steer. It would have been much more uncomfortable than a horse and carriage. And instead of taking one man and a bale of hay, it took two men and a bag of coal. It was ahead of its time. Far, far ahead of its time. It's like Trevithick. It's extraordinary, brilliant, but perverse. It's good fun, though. Nobody would support Trevithick's dragon. But as well as shaking the passengers, rattling the driver and scaring the life out of the horses, it shook the fire grate so much, all the coal fell through.
The steam carriage was a flop. Disappointed by the lack of sales, it was back to the workshop for Trevithick. There, he focused his attention on small, powerful, industrial steam engines. With industry booming across England, such engines were in high demand. His search for customers took him far and wide, and inevitably to Shropshire, where he'd enjoy the company of some of the country's most innovative ironmasters.
Ironbridge Gorge was home to the Coalbrookdale Iron Company. This was one of the busiest industrial centres in the world, busy making the cast iron cylinders that were so important for steam engines. It was a hotbed of technological development.
Trevithick now had everything he needed to turn the production of high-pressure steam engines into a real business.
Here at the brickworks, an engine could have helped mix the clay. At the colliery, an engine could wind coal up and down the shaft. There's some. At the furnace, an engine could work the bellows, fanning the flames of iron production.
And it was here that he found the solution to the problem of steering the road locomotives. Rails, or more precisely, tram tracks. This is the last remains of a horse tramway system that carried the products of Coalbrookdale down to the River Severn to be shipped. This sparked an idea that would set him off on his most ambitious project yet. A machine to run on rails. Britain's first railway locomotive was about to be born.
This locomotive was built over the winter of 1802, and its steam trials were kept highly secret. This is because James Watt was waging a propaganda war against Trevithick's use of high-pressure steam.
The spectre of professional jealousy and the fear of high-pressure steam was still there, haunting Trevithick.
I have been branded with folly and madness for attempting what the world calls impossibilities. Even the great engineer, Mr. James Watt, has said that I deserved hanging for bringing into use the high-pressure engine.
But despite the opposition, Trevithick's engine was a technological breakthrough. It was now clear the future of the high-pressure steam engine was not on the common road, but on the railroad. He had built the first steam locomotive in the world.
Because of its boiler pressure of over 50 pounds per square inch, steam exhausting through the chimney, drawing air through the fire, creating a higher firebox temperature, and traction provided by the seemingly impossible combination of smooth wheels on smooth rails, this little engine was the technological blueprint for all future steam loco development. These features were found on steam locomotives up to the end of the 20th century.
But the engine's triumph as a railway locomotive proved short-lived. Though it performed admirably, the brittle cast iron tram tracks of the time smashed under the weight of the loco. But with its large flywheel, it probably ended up doing sterling service as a stationary engine somewhere in these ironworks. But Trevithick had made his point, and when he was invited by Samuel Homfray to visit his Penny Down ironworks at Merthyr Tydfil, he offered Homfray far more than expected. Trevithick's vision was of an engine that would work pumps, power a hammer, wind coal, then take 10 tons of iron down the tramway and return with the empties. He was offering Homfray a steam railway. Homfray accepted and backed his decision by entering into a 500 guinea bet with a rival ironmaster, Richard Trevithick, that the plan would work. The engine was a success, the bet was won, but once again the engine broke the rails and it resumed static duty at the ironworks. An ignominious end for such a revolutionary engine. In need of money, Trevithick returned to designing high-pressure engines for the mining industry. But he'd come a long way, from massive static engines to the world's first steam locomotive. His ideas would filter down to the next generation of engineers. In 1829, Rocket won the Liverpool and Manchester Railways competition to find the best steam locomotive. The striking yellow, black and white engine streaked ahead of the competition at a breathtaking 35 miles an hour. The engineer, George Stephenson, was hailed a hero and would ever after be credited as the founding father of the railways. But that title rightfully belongs to the Cornish genius, Richard Trevithick.
These fiends, they've done something. It did, after all, frighten the horses.